Thank you, Rab.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Les. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so we're carrying on. This is part 2 of the Get of Cleaves series. We went through at length and in detail last week about the details of the whole controversy of the Get of Cleaves. This happened in the late 1700s. Great controversy, the most famous controversy, the most famous Get controversy, I should say. We're going to be looking at some other controversies, some other Get controversies. Now, we went through the details of the entire controversy. Basically, just to put it in short, the Chassan's family was from Mannheim, the Kallas family was from Bonn. The wedding took place in Mannheim, and the Chassan ran off Shabbos morning, Shabbos Sheva Brachas. They found him in Fahrenheit, a non-Jew, and there were serious questions about the mental stability of this Chassan. And then the uncle of the Kala, a great Talmud Chacham from Bonn, Shimon Copenhagen, got involved, and he convinced the Chassan to get a get because the Chassan had expressed plans to run away to England. He felt that he was being pursued. The Chassan ran away to England. His name was Yitzchak, family, and the Kala's name was Leah Bat Yaakov, and they arranged to get in Cleves. Right? Rabbi Lipschitz was the Rav of Cleves, and then the father of the Chassan was not present, and he only found out about the divorce much later. He was upset, and he went to the Rav of Mannheim, who was a Tevla Haas, or Hess, and Tevla Hess objected to the validity of the get. He said that the Chassan is clearly not of sound mind, and therefore the get is invalid. He wrote letters to different Rabbanim. He wrote letters to Rav Yosef Steinhardt, who was one of the Gedolei Hadar, but rejected Rav Tevla Haas's claim. But he sent letters to Frankfurt, and the Frankfurt Beis Din agreed with Rav Tevla Haas and made a public declaration that the get is invalid. Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz protested and sent letters to all the Gedolei Hadar, and they all backed Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz.
Something I was wondering, would they go and say, well, obviously the Chassan was insane, wouldn't they then at the same time be able to nullify the marriage in the first place?
Very good. So Michael, I'll repeat your question for those that are with us on the Zoom link. Michael is asking that in as much as the Chassan is insane, so by that same token the Kedushin is not valid. In fact, it's a very good question. I believe Eli asked the question last week on the Zoom. It was a very good question. And in fact, there's even a Gemara like that. Okay? We're going to have a look at this Gemara, the Gemara in Yevamis, that discusses a chayrish. A chayrish is a deaf mute, somebody that was never able to communicate properly with others because he was born deaf. So the Gemara says there is an opinion that it's a safek, but the Gemara says according to one version of the safek, sometimes he's saying, sometimes he's not saying. And the Gemara said according to that version of the doubt, we would have to be concerned that the Kedushin was valid because at the time of the Kedushin he was of sound mind, and then during the divorce he was insane. But the other version of the Safek was that he always has the same status, but the Safek was we just don't know if he is sane enough or if he has enough intelligence to be regarded as a fully sane person. And the Gemara said, therefore, according to that Safek, if the Gittin is not valid, if the divorce is not valid, neither would the Kedushin be valid. Very good, exactly. It's a very good point. Eli raised that question. It's a very strong point. It's a valid point. I accepted the point. It's another difficulty with the Frankfurt Beis Din. In other words, the Frankfurt Beis Din was objecting to the fact that he wasn't sane. So if he wasn't sane in his Kedushin, then the Kedushin is not invalid, so she didn't become an Ashes in the first place. So the Frankfurt Beis Din was concerned that he was sane at the time of the Kedushin, and he was insane at the time of the divorce. But that wouldn't make any sense, because they would have to acknowledge that sometimes the Chassan is normal, sometimes the Chassan is not normal, so who are they to decide whether he was normal at the time of the Kedushin? Which means there's another major flaw in the entire attitude of the Frankfurt Beis Din. Very well said, Michael.
But by schizophrenics,
yeah,
you do have periods of lucidity.
Lucidity, exactly.
So, but in that case, it'd be Suffolk Kedushin. You'd still need a get.
Correct, exactly. But it's up to the Dayanim who were present at the divorce to decide if at that moment he had a lucid mind or he didn't have a lucid mind. And Yisrael Lipschitz said, I was present when the divorce was given. The Frankfurt Beis Din was not present.
Wow.
So how could they decide?
Did they have maybe Adim that said that he was...
Very good. So that's what we're going to discuss today. The shir is divided up into 4 parts. One of the things we're going to discuss is were they allowed to accept Adim? They said we had testimony. So today, one of the discussions that we're going to have is, are you allowed to be makabel Adim? Are you allowed to accept testimony when the person that you're judging is not present? Okay, and that was one of the long truths that we'll have a look at today. That they weren't even, according to many Gedolim, they weren't even allowed to hear testimony when the Kala was not present, or when the Mesader Get was not present. Rishon wasn't present. Okay, so last week we talked mainly about the Chayim of Rabbeinu Tam. Let's just quickly review it. I don't think we're going to get through everything today. We'll probably need this year and the coming year to continue not complete the topic, but to give it a proper look. Okay, so number 1 on your reference sheet is the Mordechai at the end of Gittin, Remes Tafnin Hey. I put the main sections in bold. It's a very fire and brimstone chayrim, an excommunication, however you want to call it chayrim. Rabbeinu Tam and his student Rabbeinu Moshe said that nobody's allowed to object to a get after it was already given. I just put the key points in bold. Let's read and translate, so that you can get your own impression as to what the Chayim is expressing. No dayan is allowed to say, had I been present, I would have protested, I would have objected with A, B, or C. He may have objected that, let's say, the witnesses were not valid, or get. And then the last section over there, number 1 in your reference, I also put in bold. Nobody's allowed to be ma'arim. What does ma'arim mean? He plays a game, a subterfuge. In other words, he wants to question the validity of the get without technically doing so. How does he do that? He would say, Lule akzer yeshi lahashta. If it wasn't for the chayim, I would say X, Y, Z. Even that wasn't allowed. Okay? So you see how far-reaching this chayim was. Number 2 on your reference sheet, the Yam Shlomo, the Maharshal, in Gittin Perdal Beis Mem, says that the Marami Rittenberg once put somebody in chayim because of this, because somebody had objected to a get. The Marami Rittenberg was the Rabbi of the Rosh in the 1200s. There the issue was how to spell the name Merkel. Okay? With an ayin or a vav, is it? Anyways, they spelled with an ayin, Merkel, and somebody protested and said that the name was misspelled. It's supposed to be Merkel with a vav, and then because of that, the Maram put him in this chayrim, the Koich Rabbeinu Tam. Number 3 on the reference sheet is the Shut HaRitzvah in Siman Tzadivav. If you notice the Ritzvah I put in bold there, the Ritzvah here says that at the time of the giving of a certain get, this is talking about where the issue was a question of a get ma'usa. The concern was that the chassan felt forced. Okay, there was a lot of negotiation going on, and then the chatan took out an oath that he would give the get. And later he said that it's a get musa. I was forced by my oath to give the get. So the Ritzvah rejects the claim off the bat. He says if you took on an oath, that's not called being forced. You chose to take on an oath, so a person is allowed to be mizaris nafshe. A person is allowed to take a measure to reinforce his conviction to do the right thing, so that his Yetzer Hara, his evil inclination, shouldn't get the better of him later. Excuse me just a second, I just want to put this on recording. The other issue was that the Kala's family got the authorities involved and they locked him up. They locked him up in his own house arrest. So that the Ritzvah did accept the objection, that would qualify the get as being a get ma'usa. Again, chassan cannot be forced to give a get. If there's a chashash of get ma'usa, then that invalidates the get. But in the Shayla, very good. So that's a good point. Yisach was asking, what about the Ram that says Kaifin Oise Achi Yemarayitzani? So we raised that last week. There's a Kaifin Oise Achi Yemarayitzani that means if he fits the prerequisites to be required of the halacha to give a get. In other words, there are certain claims that a woman could make which obligates the husband to give a get, which is enumerated in Ksudis. But if the husband doesn't fit those prerequisites, he didn't do anything which is a violation of the marriage, he can't demand the get. Okay, so therefore, if he's being forced to give the get when she has a legal right to demand a divorce, then it's not a get ma'usa. But if she doesn't have a legal right to demand a divorce, then he's forced. You don't say the svara of Chayfin Oise Achi Yemarayitzani because he wasn't strictly obligated to give the get. So So what's interesting, interesting point from the Shut HaRitzvah, the Ritzvah first of all mentions that at the giving of the get, at the ceremony they announce the Chayrim, the first section in bold, I think that they still do this, okay, I could be mistaken, I've never, Baruch Hashem, presided over, I've never been present at any giving of a get.
It's terrible, by the way.
Yeah.
I was a witness to the get, it was absolutely awful. It was a
terrible thing. So I've never been a witness to the get. Do you recall if they announced an order that they announced a chayrim against anybody that would
I don't
later object? You don't remember?
I don't remember.
Oh, right,
I was so upset, I don't think I could remember anything.
Okay.
Terrible
thing. Okay. So the Ritzvah says at the ceremony of the giving of the get, they announced that nobody should be mitzi laz, nobody should later object to the validity of the get, and they were laz. And then what happens? After 15 days, next paragraph there in the Shut HaRitzvah, the Baal, the husband himself, the Megarish, the one that gave the bill of divorce, he himself objected to the validity of the get. Yes, you said nobody's allowed to be mitzi laz. Laz means something that's not true. Okay, to be mitzi laz. He says, but I have a true objection to the get, so therefore I'm not subject to the chayim that was announced at the giving of the get. And the Baal seems to be a clever guy. Maybe he was a Talmid Chacham as well. He says, if I see somebody that's about to take a bite out of something not kosher, I have an obligation to stop the person from eating non-kosher, correct? So if my wife really is a married woman, then I have to stop people from living with this woman. So therefore I'm not subject to the chayrim. That's what the Baal said. This is quoted in the Shubra of Itzal Ashkenazi. Itzal Ashkenazi was the Rav, the Ran of the Rabbi of the Beis Yosef. He is the author of the Shita Mukubetzet, very great scholar. So the Shubra of Itzal Ashkenazi Siman Tedvav, he quotes this argument that was made by the Baal. He doesn't quote it in the name of the Megarish, he quotes it in the name of the Ritzvah. Okay, I'm not sure if that was intentional or it was just something that he overlooked. But in any case, he seems to accept the validity of what the Baal was saying. He says, Moitzi Laz means to say if you have an unfair objection to the get, but if there's a fair objection to the get, then there's nothing wrong. We get to, I think, which is maybe the most important Mar Mokum that pertains to Chem Rabbeinu Tam. I very much am a big fan of this definition. Number 5 on your reference sheet, the Shut Marik, Siman Lamed Zayin. The Marik, Rabbi Yosef and Shlomo Kum, the Marik, he was born in 1420. He was still a Rishon. He lived in northern Italy, but he still belongs to the school of the Bali Tosfos, okay, as of the northern Italian sages. Now, he wants to give a clear definition. When does somebody violate the Cherem D'Rabbeinu Tam? When does one not violate the Cherem D'Rabbeinu Tam? And I put in bold, which I think is an excellent definition. I really enjoyed it because it gives clarity. He says, "B'derech haitzaz laz b'milsa deloi psika." Sometimes something is not fully defined. In other words, there are things you can argue about that are not black and white. It's subject to dispute. One poster could say, I think I could rely on this opinion in the Rishonim, and I maintain that you can't rely on that opinion in the Rishonim. I hold that that opinion in the Rishonim is a das yachid, and this poster calls that it's not a das yachid. That's just to give an example. So that's not, that's what Rabbeinu Tam had an issue with. When you start to object to things that are not black and white, things that are, shall we say, subjective, okay? But if there's a clear error, sometimes there is a black and white, very clear mistake, that there's no issue with the Cherem D'Rabbeinu Tam. That's the way the Marik gives the guideline as to when you're allowed to object to a get, when you're not allowed to object to a get. Number 6, the Mashardam, okay, from Saloniki, okay, also border of Rishon and Achron in 1506. He brings this Marik and he reinforces the opinion of the Marik. Okay, so I would just bear that in mind. I would bear this Marik in mind because I think it's important, and we'll see how it manifests itself with the get of cleaves. That's the main topic. Now, moving on in your reference sheet, we're going to first talk about the get of Prague. Happened in 1550. I think that the hot water is overboiling. I'm going to turn it off. Sorry to inconvenience you. 1550, the get of Prague. Now this Bachlaikis we talked about last week as well. It was the Maram Padua against Rav Shachna. Rav Shachna was the Rabbi and father-in-law of the Ramah. And there was this Rav Man, okay? Rav Man, we don't know anything about it. I had a suspicion that maybe Rav Man is not the real name. I could be completely wrong, because when the Klal Yisrael saw the man in the midbar, they didn't know what it was, so what did they say? Man who? They couldn't identify it, so man is a term that connotes uncertainty, something that you don't know how to identify, and it doesn't have a name. So I suspect, I'm emphasizing, I could be completely wrong, but I suspect that he didn't want to name the sage, she called him Rav Man. Okay, but again, it could be that was the real name. I haven't found anything about this Rav Man. I haven't discovered any historical facts about this Rav Man, except for what pertains to the Get of Prague in 1550. But again, we said that the issue of Man had three issues with the Get, as we mentioned last week. The first issue of the Get, he said the date was wrong because it was given during the twilight period. And so he says the Get was given too late, it was already nighttime, and therefore the date of the Get should have been one day later. The second issue that he had helped claim there was a Get Usa, the husband was under threats from the Kal's family. The second issue that he had, and also the third issue that he had, was that the father of the Chassan became an apostate, took on a non-Jewish name, and he said the non-Jewish name should have been written. The Amshar Shlomo Gittin has a long discussion if you need to write the Shem Loazi. Many Rishonim hold you don't need to write the Shem Loazi. You don't have to write the secular name. But anyways, these were the three objections that he had. Now the Maram Padva says, B'di Eved, I agree with Rav Shachna. B'di Eved, I hold the Get was kosher. But the fact that Rav Shachna put Rav Man into Chayrim, and Rav Shachna claimed that Rav Man violated the Chayrim of the Rabbeinu Tam, that is something that he would not accept. That's something that he protested vehemently against. Okay, he said that Rav Shachna had no right to put Rav Man into Chayrim because he raised valid objections to the validity of the Get, even if you don't agree with him. But it was a valid objection. And it takes up quite a few tshuvas in the Shud HaRamah. Again, all written by the Maram Padva. The Maram Padva is obviously a very passionate man and a very strong-minded man because he writes very strongly. You can see that it's almost scary the way he writes. But he said that after the Puma, like earth in the mouth, it's an expression of anybody who said to anybody that says that Rav Shachna violated the Chayrim of Rabbeinu Tam. And he claims there that all the Chacham of northern Italy came to the defense of Rabbeinu Tam. Now, even though the Get of Prague in 1550 was maybe not as famous as the Get of Cleves, but it seemed to have been a very great controversy. It seems that it really did involve a great number of scholars. It sounds like, in a similar fashion to the Get of Cleves, that it did involve the whole rabbinate of Europe, okay? But it's less famous. First of all, it happened much earlier in history, and also there hasn't been as much written about it. The Get of Cleves, and two entire svarim came out about the Get of Cleves, so that's why that could be another reason why the Get of Cleves is much more famous. But here, the Maram Padva doesn't give a clear, what I find as clear of a definition as the Marik. The Marik was very clear. If it's a milsa de psika, if it's black and white, then there's no Chayrim Rabbeinu Tam. If it's something that's more subjective, every dayan has to choose whether or not he thinks that this is a reason for objection. That's not a reason that you can protest. But the Maram Padva gives a little bit of a different definition. If you look at number 8 in your reference sheet, the Shut HaRamah Siman Vav, he says, "Misha nasan aget shalei b'fanav u'motza achakach psul ma beget u'mefarish v'em psul mitam zeh u'mitam zeh." As long as he clearly defines the reason why he's objecting to the get, let Allah alei Rabbeinu Tam Talmidim la'olam. That's not what Rabbeinu Tam was referring to. He was sure when somebody raises objections that are not clear, objections that the person, I hold that, for example, somebody could say, I maintain that this get is not kosher, but he doesn't exactly give clear reasons as to why he held the get is not kosher. Now, this has, even according to the definition of the Maram Padva, it seems very logical to say that that the Frankfurt Beis Din, even according to this definition, violated the Chayrim of Rabbeinu Tam, and the reason is because they didn't want to explain the reason why they passed over the get. In Lisha, they put out a proof that the man was mentally ill, and therefore the get is not kosher. So Rav Shalom, Amsterdam, the Shagas, and all the Gedolim of Europe wrote them letters, and they pleaded with them, please write a detailed protocol, what they call, as to why you pass over the get. They said, we don't need to give a protocol. Okay? So, which means that the refusal to give a protocol or to explain exactly why they invalidated the get, even according to Maram Padva, could have been enough of a reason or enough of a compelling argument to say that they actually did violate the Cherem of Rabbeinu Tam. Okay? So according to the Marik, right, many Gedolim were adamant that they did violate the Cherem of Rabbeinu Tam, and that's what the Rav of Berlin. Okay? If you look at numbers 15 on your reference sheet, sorry it's not in the right place. If you look at number 15 in the reference sheet, this is written by Rav Yoel Osterlitz, the Rav of Berlin, in Simon Chav Beis in this Aryasha. He wasn't the only one that made the argument, but I copied the way he expressed it because I like the way he expressed it. So he brings this Marik, right? The Marik says that one violates the Cherem of Rabbeinu Tam when he raises an objection b'milsa d'lo psika, something that's subjective, something that's not clearly defined. And he says this is what the Frankfurt Basin objected, that is the classic example of milsa d'lo psika. To define the mental sanity of a person is something that is very nuanced. It's very hard to define exactly if a person is mentally sane, if a person is not, you know. So he said this is the quintessential example of something that's a milsa d'lo psika. The Rav of Cleve says, I was present when the get was given. I can testify, my Beis could testify that he was normal. They say he's not normal. It's not a milsa. Right? We'll see that the definition of who's considered insane is very vague. So that's exactly what Rabbeinu Tam was talking about. Okay, that's as the expressed by Rav Yoel Osterlitz, who was the Rav of Berlin, as in number 15 in your reference sheet. Okay, so that takes us to the next major controversy, get controversy that preceded the get of Cleves. This was in 1613. It was the get of Vienna. The get of Vienna, a fascinating controversy of a get. Okay, who issued the get? This was a get that was issued by Rabbi Yeshua Falk, who was famous for his Perush Hasma, a very important commentary on Choshen Mishpat, and maybe even more well known is the Drisha and the Prisha. The Drisha and the Prisha are a very important work on the tour. So he was a very, very important posek, and he issued a get. And the Maram of Lublin, also very famous. Everybody's heard of the Maram of Lublin, okay? Important, maybe the greatest, or one of the greatest poskim of his age. He protested, he said the get is completely invalid. He had the very strong backing of the Lavush, of Mordechai Yaffa. Okay, so it's the Maram of Lublin and the Mordechai Yaffa that are objecting to the validity of the get. What was the issue? Fascinating issue. It's called a get shchivmara. This was a 16-year-old boy. He was actually has a cousin of the Maram of Lublin. His name was Rav Yitzchak. Then interesting that in the get of Cleves, the chassan that gave him was also name was Yitzchak. Very little significance. He was married to a woman named Marat Batsheva, a very young couple. They didn't have kids yet. They were clearly newlyweds. The chassan was 16 years old. And he became deathly ill. Okay, so they arranged a get so that she should not have to do chalitza. I don't know if you've ever been present at a chalitza. Chalitza is obviously much more rare than a get. I saw a video of a chalitza being done in Australia. Okay, Rav Shlomo Amar, the former chief rabbi of Israel, the Rishon LeZion, was there, and I saw how it was done. Very fascinating and also very sad, especially because we're dealing with a widow that a man dies, that no offspring is left. So sad case, but they wanted to avoid the situation. This is very common in the Gemara. You know, all sorts of cases of gittin. If anybody's going to learn gittin, they'll see all sorts of cases where a person wants to effect a divorce so that the widow should not have to go through the procedure of chalitza.
Would it deny?
Very good. So normally they used to give a get al Tanai, but Rabbi Chimi Paris, as the Mordechai brings in Gittin, made a takana, made an enactment that we should no longer give Gittin with Tanai because it creates a lot of complications.
They do that in the IDF?
Oh, so very good. So Shlomo Garner wanted to mention this Yisachar, just a question about the IDF. So if you read Rav Goren's autobiography, but also Gvura, there's a large section where he wanted to do that before soldiers go off to war, they should do what they did in Malchus Beis David. Okay, Malchus Beis David, before they went off to war, every man used to write a get to his wife, and that's why the Gemara says that on a technical basis, David, when he lived with Batsheva, wasn't technically living with a married woman. Rabbeinu Tam was of the opinion that the get was given without any Tanai. Rashi was of the opinion that the get was given al Tanai on condition. If I die, then the get will retroactively be valid. So this way, she turns out to be a divorcee and not a and not a widow. Okay? According to Rabbi Tam, that they gave the get without a Tanai, it means that the Kohanim couldn't take their wives back. What solution did they have for the Kohanim? Good question. But in any case, I don't have an answer for that, and we must have had to find other regions. One of the Kohanim didn't go to battle. Maybe the Sheikh and Levi stayed home. But some, Mechamis Mitzvah, even the Kohanim needed to go to war. Okay, so maybe they did this when it wasn't the Mechamis Mitzvah. In any case, Rabbi Echili Paris, as the Mordechai says in Gittin, they stopped this business of giving Gittin, of giving divorces with stipulation, with a Tanai, because it created a lot of complications. So you have this young Yitzchak, 16-year-old boy, he's very ill, he's dying, and they want to arrange a get so this Batsheva should not have to go through Chalitza, and they arrange the get. Now what do they do, right? Here's the chassan, this young boy with this young bride of his. If he gives the divorce, he wants her. He wants her back, right? They want to make sure that they are committed to each other. So they can't give the get all tonight. So at least they did a knas. They said that if anybody doesn't take back the ex-wife, doesn't take back if she refuses to take him back or he refuses to take her back, then there'll be a penalty of shnei alaf zehuvim, 2,000 golden coin, the currency of the time. Okay, so that's what they did. So Baruch Hashem, Yitzchak, this young 16-year-old boy, recovers from the illness. Now he's healthy again. And then there's a fight between him and his brother-in-law. There's some dispute that goes on, a lot of bad blood between them, and they decide, you know what? We're not gonna remarry. The plan was to remarry after he recovers, but they decided they don't want to. So the Kala said, you know what? You over the ksuba, we'll forgo the knas, we'll forgo the penalty, etc., etc. And they left their ways, and then she got engaged to another man. Okay, the get was, when he was a shimra, when he was deathly ill, the get was arranged by the Sma, Rabbi Yeshua Falk. Says the Maram Milublin, shimra, that's called the get musa. When a person gives a get because of his health predicament, the fact that he's on death's door, that in a sense is like forcing him to give the get. He's not giving it with full consent. That's what the argument of Maram is. So Maram wanted to make the argument that anytime a shchid gives a get, it's not a valid get. That's the argument that the Maram and he's many tshuvas, and a shouldn't have been kuf chav beis, and he writes a whole bunch of tshuvas, and a very strong backing of the Levush. And the Sma, Rav Yeshua Falk, again accused the Maram Lublin of violating the chayim of Rabbeinu Tam. And he said, I haven't violated the chayim of Rabbeinu, and he says a very similar svar as the Maram Padva. So the Maram Lublin, that lived quite a few years, a half a century after the Maram Padva, I don't know if the Maram Lublin saw the Maram Padva, they said basically more or less the same svara. That there's no violation of the chayim of Rabbeinu Tam, because the chayim, if you look at number 12 in your reference sheet, this is the Maram Lublin Kuf Chav Gimel, okay? And if you look at the bolded section in number 12 of your reference sheet, Ki lo yicham Rabbeinu Tam ela misha amad be'eit nisinat haget. Either he was present when the get was being given. Okay, one version, one case where Rabbeinu Tam applied his chayrim, if the fellow was present when the get was given, and then later he comes up with an idea as to why the get was invalid. Or the second is basically he was in the city and he could have gone. Okay? But if later something comes along and then he sees that the get is completely invalid, in that case there is no chayim der Rabbeinu Tam. So the Maram Lublin aligns in a more similar fashion with the Maram Padva, not so much like the Marik. Okay? The Marik, again, let me just repeat what we said. The Marik said the chayim der Rabbeinu Tam applied to a case where the grounds for objection is subjective. It's not a milsa de psika. According to the Maram Padva and the Maram Lublin, it's if somebody had the opportunity to protest and later wakes up and says, I found something I didn't think about, now I want to protest. Okay? In any case...
Aren't we setting up a circumstance here where no get is final?
Right, so that was what Rabbeinu Tam was trying to prevent. Rabbeinu Tam was trying to prevent a situation. Rabbeinu Tam wanted a situation where every get was final. We don't want situations where...
It seems like we've created loopholes.
Exactly, we created loopholes, exactly. That's why most poskim are mahashadam, and that's why I think that the more how shall I say, the more tenable definition is the definition of the Maharik and the Marsha Dam, and the way the Rav of Berlin accepted it, that you can't say wasn't present, there's no end to it. There are certain gittin that are completely non-starters, as they say. There was a get in Tzfat, the Beis Din in Tzfat gave a get, and the person was, the husband wasn't conscious at all. And we'll see in many makars that the husband has to be conscious. He has to be in a state of consciousness. He also has to be of sane mind. But they somehow found some loophole, and they claim that the husband, even though he was totally unconscious, he was still able to create a shliach, will create a shliach on his behalf, and almost all the boys came. I think all the boys came along and said that's a non-starter. So it's a milsa psika. But what's the quintessential case of a milsa psika, as the Rav of Berlin said? The get of cleaves. We have to define if the person is sane or not. There are many definitions of what sanity is, what insanity is. It's a very unclear, vague definition. That's what Rabbeinu Tam was trying to prevent. Rabbeinu Tam hoped to prevent the entire controversy of the get of cleaves, and he didn't manage to. Okay? It was almost like Rabbeinu Tam looked at a crystal ball and saw the get of cleaves happening, and he said, I want to prevent this whole business from happening, but he didn't manage to. Okay? And the reason was because the Beis Din of Frankfurt took an approach that aligned more so with the Maram of Lublin and the Maram Padva. Okay? Because they said that no, right? The cherem is only applicable for somebody that wakes up after he was able to protest, and we don't belong to that category. But again, we said that even according to the definition of the Maram Padva, it could be that they did violate, because even the Maram Padva said that they have to give clear protocols as to why they protest, or why they're protesting the get, and they didn't. And that was what roused the fury of all the Gedolei Hadar against the Beis Din of Frankfurt. Okay, so moving on, we're still talking about the get of Vienna. If I managed to get everybody confused, let's just make order again. There was the get of Prague in 1550. That was Rav Shachna against Rav Man. Okay, that was the one that the Maram Padva was involved in. That was the three objections we talked about. That's get number one. Get number two, the get of Vienna in 1613. That was the Maram of Lublin and the Lavush against the Sma, and then as is recorded, that the Maharsha, right, and all the Gedolim of the time, they got together, they made a gathering, and they put the matter to rest. And they said, as great as the Maram of Lublin is, and as great as the Lavush is, and they had good rabbinic backing, they said that's the end of it. Put the matter to rest. We can't continue with a situation where people are objecting to the get like this, and that was the end of the story. Okay? If you look at the Marsha in number 13 in your reference sheet, the Marsha in its Chedush Halachas at the end of Gittin and Tzadi Omid Beis, he refers to this controversy. He doesn't speak it out explicitly, but he makes a covert reference to it. And he says, "Laman yedu hadaris lahavnu laharis beget shchim masheneisni hadaris halalu." He's referring to the get of Prague. The stambalishan tnai pitukon harim in Paris. They didn't make stipulations on the get because the Marie of Paris put an end to it. After I've managed to learn entire Maseches Gittin, Amarti, I've determined that it's okay that you can have a get shchimara. Okay, even somebody that's deathly ill, he gives a get. We don't agree with the Maram of Lublin and Lavush. That's not called a get usa. It's not considered get usa. Number 14 in your reference sheet from the Sefer Aryosh and Simulam that was written by the Noid of Yehuda. The Noid of Yehuda refers to the get of Prague. Number 14, he says, you have to remember history. We have to learn from history. He issued a get in Wien. Shamarat Batsheva, Maram Lublin, the Maram was a cousin of the Chassid, and he objected. And then the Noid of Yehuda says, even though the Maram Lublin had a very strong basis to object to the get, right? He was making a very convincing argument according to the Noid of Yehuda. Okay, and he had the backing of the Lavush, the two Gedolei Hadar. Okay, and he didn't really have full consent when he gave the get. When he gave the get, is because he had the fear of death. וכיוון שעמד מחולק נבטל הגט, והיודע החזיק מרם יפה בעל הלבושים, ואף על פי כן עסק כל חכמי הדור ובראש המשל, even so, all the gedolim, right, and headed by the Maharsha, v'noslu chayrim chomor, they gave a very strong chayrim against objecting to the get, and they put the matter to rest. So the Menorah was saying is that the Sman, the Maram Levine, had a much stronger basis to object to the get. The get of Prague, those that opposed the get of Prague had a much stronger argument than the get than the Beis of Cleves, and yet the matter was put to rest with a strong chayrim, all the more so in the case of the get of Cleves, where the Beis of Frankfurt is making very weak objections to the validity of the get. Okay? So that sums up, that gives us a good summary of three major get controversies, and to see how they compare each other, and in each of the three cases, how the poskim of the time saw the case in the context of the Chaim Rabbeinu Tam. Okay? And number 16, this is Rabbi Shua Herschel, who was the senior Rav in Germany. He was the Rav of Lvov or Lemberg. And he also made the argument, he said there's no question in his mind that the Frankfurt Basin was in violation of Rabbeinu Tam's Chayrim. Okay, so that is part A of the lecture. Now we move into part B. Okay, sure.
We no longer accept any getting with Tanaim?
No, we don't do getting with Tanaim anymore because of the Yisrael's question is, do we ever do getting with Tanaim? I'm not aware. I'm not involved in getting. Other than the shir, I'm not involved in Gittin. But as far as I'm aware, and I could be, if I'm wrong, correct me, but I believe that they don't do. That's the theory of Paris was accepted. It's in the Mordechai, and you can see that from the get of Prague that they refuse to give a get with the Tanai. They don't do Tanai anymore.
So what about Rabbi Gorin?
Rabbi Gorin, yes. So Les is asking about Rabbi Gorin. So Rabbi Gorin, he talks about it at length in his book about he wanted to take care of the problem of agunos. You know, Rabbi Gorin went behind enemy lines to recover bodies of fallen IDF soldiers, Hashem Yikam Damo. And he was hoping that every single soldier would write a get. Now, if it's not a Kohen, right, they can write a get. Now, he wanted them to write a get al Tanai, even though we don't allow Gitin al Tanai, but he wanted to say for Agunot, we apply every leniency that we have at our disposal to prevent a situation where a woman is in Aguna. So he wanted to issue Gitin al Tanai. He had a lot of opposition. He said eventually it didn't gain traction because there was concern about it weakening the morale of the soldiers. Okay, they said it would be bad for the morale of the soldiers to have to write a get to their wife. It wouldn't be emotionally good for them. So therefore, the matter it didn't gain traction. Okay, but yes, it could be that Rav Gorin said they wanted to give Tanai al Gitin because. But he also had other ideas that he played with. He said maybe they could create, like, you know, by Mechiras Chametz, you can, like, power of attorney. You give over the power of attorney to the Rav to sell your Chametz. So he wanted to have such a system, Harsha'ah, where they would give over some sort of authority, or they would give over rights of representation to a certain Beis Din, and then if they went missing in action, then that Beis Din would be able to effect a divorce on the behalf of the missing soldier. Okay? If you can have a look at the Isaac where he talks about the case, it's an issue, but there were other shuls about this. For example, the Divrei Malkiel, the Divrei Malkiel of Tannenhaus, right? He talked about during the famous Russian-Japanese war, about Jewish soldiers going off to war. He also discussed about whether we can have a Tanai get given with a stipulation to solve these issues. So it's something that there's a shut from the Netziv, right? Also about soldiers going off to war. Can we arrange Gittin with Tanaim, with stipulations? Is it a violation of the Rei of Paris? On the other hand, to avoid a situation of Aguna, perhaps we could permit the matter. Okay? It's something that the Netziv dealt with, the Makil dealt with. It's something that should be given a whole other shir. Okay? So now we move on to. It hasn't been resolved. That issue hasn't really been resolved. The issue of IDF soldiers going missing in action has not been fully resolved. No. It's still a problem. If chas v'shalom, a soldier goes missing in action, it's a problem. Okay, we don't have. Rabbi Gorin didn't manage to have any of his proposals accepted. Okay, and therefore it's an issue that needs to be dealt with. Okay. Rabbi Yosef took on the lion's share of Agunas after the Yom Kippur War. Okay, and he did manage to find Hatayra and leniencies to permit most of the widows to remarry. Okay? There's even a tshuva that I read through. Rabbi there's a tshuva about 9/11. There's a case of 9/11. Rabbi has a very fascinating tshuva on that. Okay? Also another controversy that we can definitely discuss. Okay, so let's move to part B. Part B, the next issue that the Gedolim raised against the Frankfurt of Beis Din is Kabbalas Eidim. They said we heard testimonies. They refused to share. Again, I think I should emphasize the whatever we know about the Get of Cleaves comes from the Sefer Ar HaYashar. The Sefer Ar HaYashar in the beginning has the first tshuva that was written after the Get of Cleaves. It doesn't give us a lot about the Get of Frankfurt, excuse me. The Get of Frankfurt, they said they didn't give us a lot of information. Okay, it's in the Gimel of Simon in the Sefer Ar HaYashar. The Frankfurt Beis Din says that they were ignored. The guy's crazy. If you ran off on Shabbos, he didn't care about Muksa, he didn't care about Tchum, you run off on Shabbos, the Shabbos of Yeshiva Brachos, you run away. That's basically what they said, and they said, how could it be so gullible to believe that? But more than that, we don't really know what their justification was. We only see the entire compilation of tshuvas in the Har Yashar from all the Gedolim that opposed the Frankfurt Beis Din, and they were all protesting vehemently, please justify your position. This is unacceptable. You can't cancel again without giving a justification for your position. So whatever we see is from the vantage point of the Gedolim that protested. We don't see the side of the Frankfurt Beis Din. We don't see their point of view. So everything I'm saying is basically seen from the point of view of the Gedolei Hadar that opposed the Frankfurt Beis Din. Okay? So anyways, part B, they said that they heard testimonies. The Frankfurt Beis Din said we heard testimonies that the Chassan was crazy. The Chassan was not saying when he gave the get. So the Gedolim said we can't accept Eidus. That's unacceptable. Eidus, number 17 on your reference sheet. The Gemara Bavakama Daf Kuf Yud Beis. You're not allowed to accept testimony when the person that is being judged is not present. So therefore, how could you pass judgment that pertains to this Leah, to this young woman in question? You're passing judgment on Yisrael Lipschitz, who arranged the get. You can't accept testimony if those people are not present. Unacceptable. Now, if you look at the Gemara, I didn't bring the whole Gemara there in Kuf Yud Beis. There the Gemara makes it very clear that it's both for Dinei Mominus and for Dinei Nefashis. In other words, if I'm the head of a Beis Din, I can't hear testimony about you, whether it pertains to your money or whether it pertains to Nefashis, your life. Now, one of the arguments that the Gedolim made, and it's based on the Yam Shel Shlomo, based on the Marshal, that even if it pertains to your kavod, to your dignity, that's also called Dinei Nefashis. So I can't pass a judgment about your dignity unless you're present. That kind of relates back to the last shoe that we had, unless it's a kol delay pascha, right? That maybe remind you about the things we talked about the previous show about reporting allegations of abuse. But generally speaking, in most cases, I can't pass any judgment that pertains to your money, to your honor, anything that pertains to you unless you're present when the Edom are there. The Gemara there says what happens if the guy refuses to come or if he's unable to come. So the Gemara says for Dinei Mominus, if the person in question is unable to come, we have a problem. If we don't accept testimony, you have this situation where people refuse to give loans. People want to borrow money. Nobody's going to lend money because they don't want to be in a situation where if they need their money back and the borrower can't come to the Beis Din, they're not going to accept testimony. I have 5 people, I have 100 people willing to testimony that this so-and-so borrowed money, didn't pay back. Well, he's not here, he's in Miami. So that's it, I'm never going to be able to get my loan back. So the Chacham said is that if, when we deal with Dinei Mominus, the person in question is unable to come, then we do accept the Eidus. Okay? But not with Dinei Nefashis. With Dinei Nefashis, we never accept Eidus unless the person that's being judged is present when the witnesses give over their testimony. The Shulchan Aruch rules that way. In Choshen Mishpat, Simin Kuf Yud, Evav, Emekam Eidus Shlo B'fnei Baldin. Right? Basic halacha of conducting a Beis Din. Number 19 in the reference sheet, important Gemara, Yevamos Daf Kuf Chav Beis Amud Beis. Now, the Gemara there is dealing with freeing a woman so that she could remarry, a woman that's potentially guna. So the question is, do you need Drisha and Chakira? Drisha and Chakira, do you need to interrogate the witnesses? You have witnesses that come and testify, or one witness that testifies that this woman's husband died. Do you put him through Drisha and Chakira? Do you put him through interrogation? So according to Rabbi Kiva, no. According to Rabbi Kiva, yes. The Gemara says, let's just read the Gemara, the book of Mifli, Rechanina, they disagree with the principle of Rechanina, the Amr Rechanina, Dvar Torah, Echad Din Emanos, Echad Din Nefashah, Drusha V'Chakira. According to the Torah law, you need Drusha V'Chakira, you need to interrogate witnesses both when it pertains to monetary laws and judgments that pertain to a person's nefesh, to a person's life. Again, it's another thing that when it comes to the Nimaminus, that the Chacham ease the conditions so that it should be, so as not to create a disincentive for people not to give loans, a disincentive for giving loans. If you want to free this woman to remarry, it involves maminus, because she will then collect her ketuvah, what is essentially a prenuptial, right? That's what a ketuvah is. So she's going to accept money. So some say that you do need to subject the witnesses to interrogation if you want her to remarry, because in the process of remarrying, she will also take the ketuvah from the first husband. And the other one says no, it's kedinei nefashos. Now we rule leniently that we don't subject a witness if somebody comes along and says this woman's husband died, she can be married. We do not subject him to Drusha V'Chakira. That's the halacha, as all the Rishonim learn. Comes the Shut Harash, number 20 on your reference sheet, to Shut Harash Klal Memvav Simin Aleph. This is talking about a woman that had been suspected of adultery. Says the Rosh, since this involves making a woman forbidden to her husband, if a woman commits adultery, she's not allowed to stay with her husband. So therefore, number one, we have to put the witnesses that claim it was adultery, we do need to subject them to interrogation. Again, you will only accept these witnesses if the woman in question is present. In other words, we apply the stringency that you do not accept testimony from witnesses unless the person that's being judged is present. And therefore, if you wish to forbid a woman to her husband on grounds of adultery, she needs to be present when they interrogate the witnesses. That's what the Rosh says. And the only reason why we were lenient in the previous case to free Naguna, says the Shut Ramah number 21 in your average 7 Yud Beis, is because of a guna, in other words, to help to free a woman of her bondage. And number two, because it involves mamonis, because it involves accepting a ksuba. But otherwise, there's no such thing as accepting edus unless the person that's being judged is present. Okay, so it's very clearly laid down by the Shut Harash Klal Mem Vav Siman Aleph and the Shut Ramah Siman Yud Beis. I'll just read the last bold section, number 21 in your reference sheet from the Ramah and Shut Ramah. The only reason why we don't subject Eidim to interrogation to free Naguna, the famous principle that when it comes to Iguna, to free a woman so that you could remarry, we're extremely lenient. But otherwise, there's no grounds to be makel. And that's when the poskim, that's what Gedolei Adar all said, that how could the Beis Din of Frankfurt accept testimony that pertained to the sanity of this Isaac if the Kala, this Leah, wasn't present, and also Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz wasn't present? The poskim bar from the Marshal, even if it pertains to the dignity and self-respect of this Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz, that's also dinei nefashos. And therefore, if you wish to accept testimony from people that claim that this Isaac was not saying, you could not do that unless Yisrael Lipschitz was present, unless Leah was present. Number 22 in your reference sheet, Siman Lamed Beis, written by the Rav of Lvov, the senior Ashkenazic rabbi of the time. Where it says, unless you have the issue of ksuva, it's not dinei mamonos, it's dinei nefashos, and therefore the Bali Dinim need to be present. So therefore they said that even if the Frankfurt Beis Din did hear testimony that Isaac was not saying, the testimony goes out the window. The testimony is completely rejected. Okay? That's just a very short summary. You want to look at Siman Lamed Beis and Aryash, it's a very long discussion, but if I were to go through the entire Pilpul and all the different halacha aspects of the get of cleaves, we'd be here for months. Okay? The hardest part of this year was not what not to say, because everything I wanted to said. Eventually, I said, if we're going to just put everything in, we could just learn Sefer Hayashah. We can learn our Hayashah together. We can go through the whole Sefer, but just take some of the key points. Okay. Number part C. Right, another fascinating angle that pertains to the whole controversy. Again, many of the Gedolim discusses the samchus of the Beis Din. What is the level of authority that the Frankfurt Beis Din has to disqualify a get and then say, we don't have to give the protocol, we don't have to explain to you, to the Gedolim, why we invalidated the get.
Well, more than that, they overrode another Beis Din.
They overrode another Beis Din, which we already mentioned that one of the chayrims that they made, aside from the chayrim of Rabbi Tam, that many years before, and it was reinforced in Frankfurt of all places, that no Beis Din is allowed to get involved in the jurisdiction of other Batei Dinim. You can't issue a gzeira that pertains to another Beit Din, okay? And in our Hayashar, right, the Yisrael Lipschitz recounts all the details of the Chem and who signed it, and he even gives the name of those Frankfurt Dayanim that reinforce the Chayrim. Again, as I emphasized, aside from the Chayrim Rabbeinu Tam, one Beis Din is not supposed to mix in with the business of another Beis Din in another area. So anyways, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, number 23 in your reference sheet. This is an important halacha. Amr of Safra says of Safra Shnaim Shnis Amsu B'Din. You have two people that have a disagreement. They have a disagreement, a monetary disagreement between them. One says, I want to be judged by the local Beis Din. The other one says, I want to go to another city where there's a more prominent Beis Din. So the halach is kaifan oiseh b'dan b'iroi. No, they have to go to the local Beis Din. In other words, you can't force people to get up and stop their affairs and stop their lives to go to some far place. If two people have a disagreement, they could force each other to take the case to the local Beis Din. Why? Because even the local Beis Din, if they're not sure about the matter, they can always write to the more prominent Beis Din. They can get a backing. They could clarify the matter with the more senior Beis Din. Here comes the key point. If one of the litigants says, I want a written justification of the psak, I suspect that the Dayanim here made a mistake. He's able to demand that he get a written protocol as to why he was subjected to a certain psak. Okay, he has that legal right. It's ruled in the Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin Perek Halacha. It's also halacha in Choshen Mishpat in Siman Yudalid, where the Shulchan Aruch says that a person is allowed to say, number 26 on the reference sheet, I want a written justification as to why you judge me in this way. Maybe you made a mistake, because I can make mistakes. They first have to write out a written justification of their psak, and then they could extract the money that they believe he owes. Says the Rambam, and this is the way the Beis Yosef and Siman Yudav understood the Rambam, that this is only a case where they didn't go to the Beis Din Hagadol in Yerushalayim. In other words, it's a continuation of the first part of the Gemara. The first part of the Gemara was, Reuven wants to go to the greater Beis Din, Shimon wants to go to the local Beis Din. So Reuven says, fine, I'll go to the local Beis Din. But I don't trust the local Beis Din, so that's why I could demand a written justification of the psak. But the way the Beis Yosef understood the Rambam, if they go to the Beis Din Hagadol, if they go to the most prominent Beis Din of the generation, then they don't need to give a justification for the psak. Let me repeat what I said. The demand to get a justification, a written justification for the psak, is only because they went to a lower level Beis Din. But if they go to the highest level Beis Din, they don't need to give a justification of the psak. Okay? Now this is a brilliant, Siman Lamed Beis, one of my favorite Simonim in the Ar Hayosh, again written by Rabbi Yeshua Heschel, the Rav of Lvov, the Rav of Lemberg, brilliant piece. So he plays along with this whole Gemara. He says, the Gedolei Adar are pleading with the Frankfurt Beis and give us a justification for your psak. So they said, we don't need to. Okay? So he says clearly, now he's speaking half jokingly and half seriously. Okay? He's like promoting their alleged position, and then he's trying to illustrate the absurdity of what they're trying to promote. He says, Af ki kol chachmei, I'm reading the third line in number 28 in your reference sheet. Af ki kol chachmei shal mufusar b'derei seinu shalom avak shaleidem eizetam shalanu kach. All the Gedolei Hador are begging to know why you canceled the get. Not only that, this poor girl, Leah, is begging to know why you canceled her divorce. Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz, who issued the get, is begging to find out why you canceled the divorce that he issued. But so what do you have to say? What must the Frankfurt Beis Din be thinking? Shechachmei Frankfurt, Tomchu Yisoidam, they rested their idea, their foundation, on Masha Kosav Beis Yosef, based on what the Beis Yosef said, Behuva Barama, B'chosh Mishim Simin Yudalin, She'ein Tzirchem Nichta Be'ez Tam Ela Beis Din Kotel, Beis Din Golo. Right? The Beis Yosef said that if it's the greatest Beis Din of the generation, they don't need to write a justification. So clearly they must maintain that the Frankfurt Beis Din is the greatest Beis Din of the generation, so they don't need to give any justification. That's what they must hold if they refuse to justify their psak, right? Okay? So he says, okay, that's very nice. The Frankfurt Beis Din thinks that they're the Beis Din Hagadol of their generation. And all the Gedolei Hador, the Shabbos Aryeh, the Noda Yehuda, the Rav Shalom of Amsterdam, Rav Yeshua Heschel of Lvov, the Yavitz, and all the super giants of the generation, they're like a Beis Din Katan, right? So you see the sarcasm, he's being half serious, but he's being half sarcastic, okay? It's just very beautiful literary style. First of all, they're just nice. I just really enjoyed that their literary style was very entertaining. Right? Today, we've lost that magic touch. But today, the Tshuvas are dry. It doesn't have the same... I mean, they were the great Achronim Rishonim were not only greater in Torah, but they were also better writers than most people today. Okay?
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed it. It's a fascinating tshuva. It's a riveting tshuva. I mean, the whole sefer is riveting, and I wish I could just discuss everything that's there. But then there's another issue that also Rishon Heschel raised, and that's number 29 in your refugee. It's based on the Gemara Bava Metzia Daf Samach Tes. There's an interesting story where you had two partners that split up the cash. They had funds and they split it up, but they knew exactly how much money was available. They split up, and one partner split up the money when the other partner wasn't present, and the other partner was upset. Why did you split up the money when I was not present? So the Rav Nachman told them, you know how much money was in the safe. You know, it was let's say 1,000 rubles in the safe. You got half of it, so what's your issue? The next year, the same partner that split up the money, the next year split up the wine. And the other part was livid. Why did you split up the wine when I was not present? So they came in front of Rav Papa, and Rav Papa said, he's right. So the first guy says, I think that you're against me. You don't like me, that's why you're passing. Last year, Rav Nachman said, I'm allowed to split up the money. This year, you tell me, Rav Papa, a different posting, a different Rav, that I'm not allowed to split up the wine. So I think that you're conspiring against me. I think maybe you received the bribe from the other guy. I don't know if that's what the Gemara says, but I think that you're up to something. So what did Rav Papa say? Oh, if the dayan is already being suspected of misconduct, of corruption, then he needs to issue a written psak. So that's what the Shulchan Aruch and Chosh Mishpat Siman Yudalit says, if the dayan sees that one of the litigants suspects the dayan of misconduct or corruption, then he needs to write a written protocol even if he's not asked to. So just to get this straight, if one of the litigants says, I want a written justification for the psak, the dayan needs to write it unless he's the Beis Din Hagadol. But if the dayan sees that he's being suspected of misconduct, then he needs to write the protocol even if he's not asked to.
And even if he's the greatest...
And even if he's the Beis Din Hagadol, beautiful, thank you, Yisachar, number 31, the Bach and Chosh Mishpat Siman Yudalim says that if he's suspect of misconduct, if he's suspect of corruption, then even the Beis Din Hagadol needs to write a psak. Number 31 says the Bach, because the Beis Din Hagadol ain't sarach shichtav loy, if the Beis Din Hagadol is suspected of corruption, then they need to write a justification for their psak. Okay? So number 32, the Ar HaYashar comes with Heschel and says the Beis Din Hagadol, the Beis Din of Frankfurt is not suspect to suspicion, is not suspect of corruption. Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz is screaming bloody murder. The Kala and her father, they're screaming bloody murder. The Gedolei Hador are screaming bloody murder. Tell us why you cancel the get on the notion that the guy was insane when Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz said, I saw the guy was sane. That's not called being suspect? Even if you are the Beis Din HaGadol, again, he plays along with his whole narrative. He says, even though you think that you're the Beis Din HaGadol of the generation, but you're suspect that all the Gedolei Hadar, so surely you need to write up a justification for your psak. Okay?
Wow.
So that was part C of the Shir. Part D of the Shir we'll say for next week, where that gets to the core issue, which is the most difficult of this whole topic, is how do you find somebody who's being sane, somebody who's not sane. Part D, you have all the marmakomas in your reference sheet. If anybody wants to review that, they can come prepared for next week's Shir. And it's the hardest part because, as you can imagine, it's very obscure, it's very subjective, and it's something that's very difficult to define, and that will be the topic of next week.
Next week, would you tell us how the Frankfurt Beis Din, how it was resolved?
Yeah, I can do it. How
did they apologize? Did they?
Okay, so basically, what Les is asking, how did the Frankfurt Beis Din react to this? So as I mentioned last week, Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz in the Ar Yosha and in his Sefer Ar Yisrael, as we saw there, I read it out in last week's Shir, how he says that he has first-hand testimony that Rav Abish, he says the Chassid Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh L'Bracha, he refers to him in great reverence. I have no tightness, I have no grievances against him. Only my grievances are against the other Dayanim, Rav Nosson Maz, who's the big bad guy over here. My grievances are against the other Dayanim. And I know for a fact, he says, when Shimon Copenhagen was in Frankfurt, he testified that he heard testimonies, I don't know if they're true or not, but this is what Shalosh is claimed, that Avram Abish found out that he had been misled, he had been fooled, and he cried out in agony, and he said, why did you fool me? And he said, but the Frankfurt Dayanim are so violent, they're so aggressive that they're twisting his hand and they're forcing him to remain silent. So he said, I have no tightness in it. But really what happened is when Avram Abish died, right, that was the end of the controversy, because there was nobody. The only thing that the Frankfurt Dayanim said, we have Avram Abish. Avram Abish was the only counterweight against the Noida Behuda, the Shagas Aryeh, and the Shalom Amsterdam, and all the super giants that were against them. With the passing of Avram Abish, right, there was no more backbone to stand up against the super giants of the generation, and that basically brought the entire controversy to a close. There is a legend, some claim it's true, but there's a lot of evidence against it, that we know that the Frankfurt Beis Din did actually manage to get this Isaac back from London. The son of the Yavitz, who was actually a Rav in London, met with the boy, met with this Isaac, and testified that the boy actually is sane. And one of the Shalom Amsterdam wrote, he says, who says the man is insane? I don't know who raised this last week. Roshel Amsterdam said maybe he felt sorry for the girl, he didn't like her, but he didn't, some people, they don't know how to say things openly. They always try to find, a backward way. See, trying to get out of it. Or maybe he ran away, he wanted to run away, but he didn't want to leave this girl as a naguna. Maybe that's why he concocted this entire story. But I'm saying, Roshel Amsterdam says there's no compelling reason to say that a person has to be insane because he runs away to England. People run away. Oh, maybe he wasn't involved in the mafia. How do you know? What do you know? What do we know about people's private lives? But what they actually did do is they managed to get the chassan back from London. The chassan came back to Frankfurt, and the Frankfurt Beis Din demanded that Leah come back to Frankfurt, and the father said, "No way! I'm not subject to the Frankfurt Beis Din has jurisdiction over me to tell me that I have to come to Frankfurt, right?" But in the end, there are claims that they remarried. There are stories, there are legends about the couple being remarried, but again, there's a lot of objections to it. Okay?
Wow.
Okay, so we'll start over here.
Unbelievable.